My observation is that in our culture, I mean, compassion for oneself may be natural. And if a baby was born and raised without a lot of other messages, maybe they would naturally develop self-compassion. That could be true. We still have quite a lot of sort of puritanical beliefs in our culture about productivity and about working hard and about ignoring our basic needs, ignoring our emotions, ignoring even things like hunger or the need to use the bathroom if you're at work, because productivity above all else. And I think that a lot of those cultural messages lead us to ignore and not build a sense of self-compassion. We have welcome to the Growth and Thriving podcast, where we celebrate the stories of those who have overcome great trauma and adversity in their lives and examine the tools and techniques by which people overcome adversity, make themselves resilient, grow, and create lives of thriving. I'm your host, Dr. Jerry Sunshine Novak, and today I'm going to be talking to you about self-compassion. A few weeks back, I shared a meme with the online Facebook community that talked about the myths of self-compassion. I can bring that up and share that with you so you can see what that looks like. And so you can see here, this meme has the 5 myths of self-compassion. And there's these assumptions, these ideas that self-compassion, if we're to be compassionate and kind to ourselves, that it's a form of self-pity, that it means weakness of character, that it makes you complacent and unlikely to grow or to work on improving yourself, that it's somehow narcissistic, and that self-compassion is selfish. And so I offered, when I shared this meme, I offered to talk about what self-compassion is and how it works and what the research says. And I had some response from folks asking me to do that. So that's what today is going to be about. It's going to be about the ins and outs. We're going to define self-compassion. We're going to talk about what the research says, the neurobiology of self-compassion, and how to use it in a life that's dedicated to growth and thriving. So anyway, let's jump in. First, let's define what self-compassion means. If you see me looking down here, I have some notes because I want to make sure there's important points that I don't skip. But let's start this discussion. So first off, self-compassion means that we are kind and understanding when confronted with our own personal weaknesses or failures. So in order to, again, I think upon hearing this, many people could jump to see its weakness. If we're going to be kind and understanding about our failings, that means weakness, or it means self-pity somehow. And I'm not sure that that's true. Treating a weakness with kindness and understanding doesn't mean we're accepting of that weakness. It doesn't mean we're allowing it to persist. It doesn't mean we're succumbing to it or that we're going to just live with it or make excuses for it. It's none of that, right? And you'll see as this podcast progresses, as this episode progresses, that we're going to talk about how self-compassion actually helps us address these weaknesses and work on them more so than, say, self-criticism or other harsher approaches. It's not about pity, and it's not about weakness, and it's not about allowing our failings to stand. It's about addressing them with kindness. If you could think about, being a coach on a team or working with a classroom of students, if something doesn't go well, we're much more likely to in the moment, in the heat of a game, we might be yelling, come on, go, tough it out, push it out. But at the end of the game, we're going to typically come to folks with understanding and kindness, especially if our team played hard. We're going to say, listen, you guys played your hearts out. You tried as best you could. There were some things that we need to work on, some things we need to improve, right? There's some strategic flaws or some performance flaws, and we need to work on those. But we're going to work on them in a way that shows care and compassion for each other. It's going to show rigor and hard work as well, and accountability, but it doesn't need to be cruel. And that's where self-compassion comes in. So self-compassion, again, is that we are kind and understanding with ourselves when confronted with personal failures. And so there's this idea that it makes you complacent. If you look at myth number 3, right, it makes you complacent. But the irony is that we actually are more likely to pursue change because we care about ourselves, as opposed to feeling like we are worthless or unacceptable as we are. And even if you're somebody who's going to say, well, I don't see myself as worthless or unacceptable, think about the last time you encountered some sort of personal failing, either something in a relationship that you didn't do well, a pattern that you repeat, or something you tried to achieve, maybe something academic or something professional that didn't go the way you wanted it to. And if your self-talk, if the things you say to yourself are like, geez, you're such an idiot, and why can't you ever get these things straight? And see, I knew you couldn't do this. And anything along those lines are not compassionate, right? Those are statements about our worth, right? See, you're such an idiot. That's about me as a person. That's not about, well, you tried really hard, but this thing got away from us, or we didn't achieve what we wanted to on this time. I didn't achieve what I wanted to on this time. There's a big difference. And in all likelihood, if you listen to those messages closely, and it's easy to miss them, they become very habitual and we don't even know we're doing it. But if you can tune in and pay attention and hear yourself saying things like, God, you're such an idiot, or I knew you were going to screw this up, the odds are that those messages, you've heard those somewhere else, maybe when you were younger. And I don't know, it could have been a parent, it could have been a teacher, it could have been a coach, but probably somebody that you looked up to or hoped to have approval from spoke to you this way, and those became your messages. The problem with those messages is because they're about our self-worth, about us being stupid or inept or a poor athlete or weak or soft or whatever it is, because that's about our sense of self, it brings up feelings of shame, feelings like, at our core, we're not good enough. At our core, we're too soft, too weak, too dumb, too bad at relationships, right? Too whatever it is to get what we want. And that sense of shame that that's who we are at our core is in the way of trying again, right? Because if that's who we are, why would we try again? Conversely, if who we are is worthy, is good enough, right? We're just as good, if you will, as anyone else, and we fail at this, well, then there's the potential to work at this thing and to get better at it. And it doesn't make us inherently unworthy. And so we'll unpack this a little bit more as we go. But the idea is that treating ourselves with some humanity and with some grace actually encourages us, according to the research, to continue to work at things and to do better. So like most things in the realm of self-improvement, mental health, social science of any sort, self-compassion is an umbrella term that has a couple of domains beneath it. And according to Dr. Kristen Neff, who is the sort of the self-compassion guru, she's the name associated with most self-compassion study and research. There are 3 domains that make up self-compassion. The first is self-kindness versus self-judgment. To think about that, we have to understand what judgment is, right? What is judgment? And that's another one that's tricky if we don't exercise and build the awareness of it. Because human beings are judging machines. We walk through the world with the mistaken assumption that our opinions, our judgments are somehow facts, and they're not. And I can demonstrate to you how a very simple change in language, in the narrative, changes our perception from judging to recognizing our preferences, which is fine, but not having those preferences become the story of ourselves, the story of the other person, the story of the thing or the situation. So for example, if you are out and about and you see somebody wearing an outfit, and you say, man, that outfit is hideous. That outfit is ugly. There's a judgment on the outfit. If you walk into a room and you say, man, it is sweltering hot in here, there's a judgment. And the word is, right? Man, that outfit is ugly. It is sweltering hot in here. That's sort of what creates the narrative, right? And most judgments kind of fall into the categories of good or bad. That thing is good, that thing is bad. This situation is good, this situation is bad. And it can be tricky. We're sort of raised with that as normative. We think of things as good or bad. Even emotions, we think of emotions as good emotions or bad emotions, right? We think of happiness, joy, love as being good emotions. We think of, sadness, anxiety, stress as being bad emotions. And what's probably truer and maybe more useful in our day-to-day lives is not so much that things fall into good or bad, but that there's things we like and things we don't. So if we take, man, that outfit is hideous, and we change it to, I really don't like that outfit, that changes the perception, right? The outfit itself is no longer bad. It's no longer ugly. I don't like it. And my opinion's valid, and that's fine. And there's probably other people that share my opinion, but it leaves space for the fact that other people can also like that outfit and not necessarily be wrong. If I change it from, man, this room is sweltering hot, to this room feels uncomfortable to me. I feel hot in this room. I'm uncomfortable. It still validates what I'm experiencing, that I'm warm, that I'm uncomfortable. But instead of making the narrative that the room is a certain way and anybody else who is comfortable in this heat is incorrect, right? I've judged this thing as bad, and if you disagree, you're incorrect. By recognizing that it's my judgment, my preference, it's valid. I'm entitled to my judgment, but it also leaves space for somebody else's experience to be valid. This comes into play a lot in terms of interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, leadership positions, parenting, right? Your kids can have a perception different from you, and both can be valid, right? There are instances where somebody is legitimately incorrect, right? If your kid's doing their math homework and they say 2 times 2 is 5, well, I mean, yes, that's incorrect. That's not a matter of opinion. But if you think the only careers your kid should pursue are, law, medicine, or accounting, and your kid falls in love with art and wants to be a graphic artist, those are differences of opinion. And your preference and the career choices you like may not be, and in fact, if you look around in the world, are not the only career choices available. Plenty of people make very good livings and have good life satisfaction and are happy doing things that are not those 3 career choices. So understanding judgment, right? So the first domain, going back, the first domain that we find in self-compassion is whether it's self-kindness or self-judgment. So if we attempt something, if we go to take a course, an adult education course, or we try to sign up for a new sport or a new adventure of some sort, and we fail at it, especially in the beginning, initially, meeting ourselves with judgment is very much like, see, I knew I wouldn't be able to do this. I'm so uncoordinated. That's a judgment, right? Where's the line for coordination? Who decides what's coordinated enough and what isn't, right? I mean, sure, there's a continuum. You can look at an Olympic gymnast and say they have better coordination than I do, but there's no line under which it's like, well, from here down, you're a failure at coordination. Additionally, coordination is the kind of thing that could improve with some practice. But if we judge ourselves, it becomes impossible, right? If I'm just uncoordinated, how can I improve that, right? If my coordination is lacking and I need to build it up, then I can work on it. If I take a course and I don't do well in the course, and it means I'm dumb. That's my judgment, is I'm so stupid. Well, then how can I improve, right? If I'm stupid, I'm stupid. But if I wasn't prepared for how difficult this course was going to be, or if I took it too lightly, or if I didn't study hard enough, those are all things I can work on. So when we bump into that first failure, do we treat ourselves with some kindness? And a kindness doesn't mean there's no accountability, right? You heard me say, boy, I took that course too lightly, or I didn't prepare well enough. I didn't carve out enough time to study or to write those papers, right? Those are accountability. That's on me. But because I'm being kind about it and I'm not attaching it to my character, there are mistakes I made, but not because I'm an idiot or I'm dumb or I'm worthless. I can work on them and improve them. So that's domain one. Domain two is common humanity versus isolation. So this is sort of cognitively, if you think about it, it's a little bit abstract, but it builds on the first concept, right? Common humanity versus isolation. So common humanity means, do you treat yourself the way you would treat any other human being? And most of the time, for many of us, the answer is no. We're much harder on ourselves typically, right? A lot of us tend to be our own worst critics. And if somebody else makes a mistake or screws something up, especially if it's somebody we love and care about, and especially if it's somebody who has a track record for doing things well, right? Somebody who has succeeded at a bunch of things, but then tries this thing and doesn't do well, right? If this is a person who's had a bunch of successes and they decide to take that night course and they fail the course because it was more than they expected, we tend to give them some grace. Hey, listen, like, there's no way for you to know how much that course was going to entail before you started, or, you know, it seemed reasonable at the time, like it seemed like you would have the time to do it, but then your life circumstances got kind of hectic and that took away the time. We give them grace. And so do we treat ourselves with that same common humanity? Like, hey, I did underestimate how much time that course was going to take, but, you know, and I also didn't realize that my personal circumstances were going to get a little hairy while I was in the course, or whatever it is. The reason why that is juxtaposed, common humanity with isolation, is that the harder we are on ourselves and the less we treat ourselves with common humanity, the more, maybe unconsciously, it separates us from everyone else. If we would treat everyone else with this sort of common humanity, but not ourselves, then we're somehow different. And we're not somehow different in a wonderful way. We're somehow different in a way that makes us less than, right? We're dumb. We should have known better. We're foolish, right? These are all our character judgments. And when we have those judgments on ourselves, which is in the first domain, right? Self-judgment, it leads us to want to hide them from everyone else, to cover them up, to put our best foot forward, right? When you go for a job interview or you meet somebody for the first time or you chat with somebody on a dating app, you don't open with like, hey, here's all the things that are wrong with me. You want to put your best foot forward. But the idea of intimacy, of getting to know people, is that over time, they get to see you more holistically. They get to see your strengths and your abilities. They get to see how you function under pressure. And they also get to see you at your worst. They get to see you on a bad day. They get to see you when you're sick. They get to see you when you haven't slept well. They get to see you when your stress level has reached, beyond the threshold that you can manage well. And the idea is that we build closeness with people through them seeing us in those worst times and us seeing them in their worst times and still accepting one another, right? And again, it's not complacency. If you look at the 5 myths, it's not like, well, it's okay. It's if somebody is overstressed and they lash out at you and they're someone you care about, it's okay to say, hey, that was unacceptable. Like, we can't do that again. We have to find a way around that. But I value our friendship or our relationship enough that we can work that out. That's where closeness comes from. when we are always putting our best foot forward and we can't let anyone see our ugly spots, our flaws, our scars, we keep those covered when everything, then people never get to see the real us. They never get to see the whole person. There's always parts that are protected, that are off limits. And people know that. And so there's distance. And because there's distance, we end up either literally or like figuratively, emotionally isolated, because nobody knows the real us, right? Even on our worst days, we're putting on a happy face and making right. And I'm not suggesting, like, there's a time and a place, right? Not everyone deserves your authenticity or your vulnerability, right? And if you have a big board meeting, or if you're a performer of some sort and you have a show that night and you're having a bad day, then yeah, put on the happy face and the show must go on. Or go and do your board meeting for sure and be chipper and pleasant. But when you're interacting with the people who matter, then maybe there's an opportunity to be a little bit more real. Does that make sense to everyone? I hope so. You can leave a message for me on the socials. If it doesn't, I can explain it more. But the idea is with these three domains, with the three domains we're talking about, the first one, again, going back, is self-kindness versus judgment. If you treat yourself with kindness when you bump into a failure or a hiccup in your plans, that actually paves the way for you to treat yourself with common humanity, right? The self-kindness, like, oh, this didn't go the way I wanted to, and it's okay. I mean, it's unfortunate. It's not what I wanted to happen, but everyone screws up, right? Now we're starting to get into common humanity, that idea of everyone screws up, everyone makes a mistake from time to time. That's common humanity. If we start on the other side with self-judgment and we bump into that hiccup or that speed bump in the road and we go, oh, God, I'm such an idiot. I'm so stupid. How can I think I could accomplish this thing? What is wrong with me? That's paving the road toward isolation. Because now I don't want people to see how stupid I am, and I don't want to put that on display. And so I don't allow closeness, and I keep, because of a sense of shame about how dumb I am or how worthless I am, I keep people at a distance, and I only show them strategic parts of myself. And while they may not know exactly what it is I'm covering, they know I'm not showing them everything. And so there's this distance, and they may spend time with me, we may be friends or colleagues, we may work together. So we may technically have some interaction, but those interactions are going to be limited because they don't get to see all of who I am. Now, the third domain is mindfulness versus over-identification. So the idea is that we're all subject to the harsh inner critic. So most of us, it's very common that we, I keep using this example of taking a course and failing it, but it could be anything, right? We decide we want to join the gym, and then we've paid for the gym membership for 6 months and we've only been there twice, right? Whatever it is, it's really common for us to be like, oh, I'm so lazy. God, I'm so out of shape. I knew I shouldn't have done this. It's such a waste of money. I'm so wasteful, right? These are all the judgments on myself. And even though I try to act with self-compassion, I'm likely to fall into that trap once in a while. So here's where mindfulness versus over-identification comes with. Mindfulness, by definition, and those of us who have maybe a meditation practice or are probably familiar with mindfulness, if you've taken yoga, you've probably encountered this term. People who have an interest in Buddhism may have encountered this term. There's a lot of mindfulness talk through the mental health community. And there are some aspects of the Western religions of Judaism and Christianity that include mindfulness as a part. Mindfulness is about remaining present in the moment, right? A lot of our emotional despair is related to anticipation. We're nervous or worried or upset about a thing that might happen or that's going to happen or that we're thinking about. And a lot of sadness and depression can be related to things in the past, right? That we are recalling in our memory, and we're thinking about the injustice we suffered or about how unfair things were or about how poorly we were treated. And so Mindfulness is about being in the moment. And yes, I may have a surgical procedure coming up in a few weeks, or a big exam coming up, or something, a big presentation that I'm very nervous about coming up in a few weeks. And the more I think about that, the more nervous I get in the here and now. And the more upset, my stomach might get upset, my blood pressure could go up. All sorts of biological, physical things could happen, and cognitive and emotional things could happen too. The issue is I'm upsetting my here and now, my right now, with anticipation of what might be in the future. And the more I can stay present about what is or is not happening now, the less likely I am to suffer. Right? That doesn't mean you don't plan for the future. It doesn't mean I don't prepare for a big presentation or study for a big exam. But while I'm studying for the exam, I'm not taking the exam. I'm also not failing the exam, and I'm not acing the exam. And so as I'm studying for the exam, if I'm being mindful, if I'm practicing mindfulness, then my emotional reactions and my thoughts and feelings about preparation, about studying, are not going to be influenced by my fear of the exam, which is still several weeks away, or my fear of the presentation, which is still several weeks away. It's entirely possible for me to be nervous about a presentation. A lot of people get worried about public speaking, and I could be nervous about a presentation and still really enjoy preparing the presentation. If it's a topic that I enjoy, that I have an interest in, if I'm proud of how it's coming together, I can feel those things in the moment. Same thing with the past, right? The more time I spend ruining the things that have happened to me, that I've lived through, the times that there was injustice or I was treated poorly or unfairly, the more I'm experiencing sadness and depression and regret or resentment in the moment, when I'm not experiencing the cause of those things anymore. And so there was a really interesting study that was done a while back where these researchers found people who were scheduled to have an invasive surgical procedure that was known to have sort of a longer, more painful kind of recovery. It was, I don't remember what the procedure was, but the idea was that these people were going to go through something unpleasant. And for several months, 6 or 8 months leading up to the procedure, and for a year after the procedure, they gave these people instruments to fill out every month or so. And the instruments were about levels of anxiety, levels of depression, and levels of overall life satisfaction, right? How happy were they? How satisfied with their lives? And what they found was that for months ahead of the procedure, the anxiety and depression scales were higher and the life satisfaction was lower. And for months after the procedure, anxiety and depression were higher and life satisfaction was lower. But during the period in which they had the procedure and were going through the recovery, the anxiety and depression scores reduced and life satisfaction was higher. And so the researchers interpreted this to mean that, generally speaking, our anticipation of a thing and our memory of a thing are typically worse than the thing itself, meaning we upset ourselves more than we need to. And so how does this all tie back into self-compassion in this third domain of mindfulness versus over-identification? Well, it works like this. Over-identification means that when those, what they call the stinking thinking, right? When those nasty messages pop up in your brain, oh, I'm so stupid, I knew I shouldn't have done that. Or I'm so lazy, why did I even bother joining the gym? I never make this happen, right? When those things pop in, if we're being mindful, if we're practicing mindfulness, then the first thing we do is we recognize that that's what we're doing. Oh, listen to how I'm talking to myself. Listen to what I'm saying to myself right now. And we can gently remind ourselves that there are plenty of times that we've succeeded or done well or achieved really difficult things or overcome great hardships. There's probably plenty of examples of our intelligence, of our resilience, of our ability in some level. There's also mistakes, sure, there's also problems, but the idea is that if there are these successes, then the problems are not a reflection of our character as much as maybe just bad judgment in the moment or an honest to goodness error, right? A mistake of some sort. And so if we're practicing mindfulness and we hear ourselves saying these things to ourselves, then in the moment we can sort of put the kibosh on it and say, no, 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 that's not universally true. And that judgment is going to lead me down a road of outcomes I don't want, right? If I want better outcomes, then maybe this is an opportunity for me to adjust that voice and say things that are more reasonable and more true. I can still hold myself accountable for mistakes, but I can do so with kindness, right? Otherwise, if I don't practice mindfulness, what's going to happen is I'm going to start to tell myself, oh, you're so dumb, you're so stupid, how could you do this? Or you're so lazy, why did you join the gym? And I'm going to over-identify with those messages. And the more I over-identify with those messages, the more my brain is going to find confirming evidence. Other times that I was lazy, other times that I made stupid decisions, other times that I didn't follow through on a thing I said I was going to follow through. And it's going to use that to say, see, this is your character. This is who you are. And that's going to be in the way. That's going to create the isolation. It's going to make me not want people to see those parts of myself. It's going to limit my sense of vulnerability. It's going to make me want to only show people my best sides. Not that people shouldn't see my best side, but it's incomplete if that's all they're seeing, especially people I try to be close with. And it's going to lead me down a road of trying to just cover up potential weaknesses instead of maybe working on them and turning them around. So those are the three domains. Just to recap one time, self-kindness versus self-judgment is domain 1. Domain 2 is common humanity versus isolation. And step 3 or domain 3 is mindfulness versus over-identification. So, and there's actually an instrument on the website selfcompassion.org, which is Dr. Kristen Neff's website. She has an assessment where you can take a self-compassion assessment and see how you do in each of these 3 domains. Do you treat yourself with kindness or do you treat yourself with judgment? Do you treat yourself with common humanity or with isolation? And do you treat yourself, are you mindful about the things you say and feed your brain, right? The way an athlete would be mindful of what they eat or drink in order to keep their bodies healthy and performing well. We need to be mindful of what we feed our mind and our emotions, or do we over-identify with everything that pops into our head as though that's a true reflection of who we are? And again, I would encourage you, if you decide to go take that assessment, to not get too hung up on like, oh, here's my score, it means I'm bad at this, or it means I'm judging myself and I'm isolating. I would look at whatever you score on that assessment as a starting point and think about where you want to be and consider it a continuum. Because the truth of the matter is, for the rest of your life, there will probably be days where you're better at these things and days when you're not so good at these things, right? A day when you're haven't slept well or you're overstressed, or maybe you've had a couple of, kind of rough interactions or rough experiences in a row, you might be a little worse with these things. But give it a week or two and you start, exercising more regularly, you're eating a little better, you're setting interpersonal boundaries, and you might actually be a little better with these things, if that makes some sense. I hope so. So that's the definition and the domains that we find in self-compassion. Let's talk a little bit about where this plays out in the world. And one of the things that fascinates me personally, I don't know if you'll find it as interesting, I hope so, is in the last couple of decades, there's been quite a bit of research that has demonstrated that many of the tenets and beliefs and ideas in Buddhism, and there's various sects of Buddhism, right? There's Tibetan Buddhists and Korean Buddhists, there's Zen Buddhists and Taoist Buddhists, but generally the belief systems in Buddhism, a lot of research has been demonstrating that Buddhist beliefs and practices line up nicely with neurobiology. And so when we look at brain function and how the brain works, we find that Buddhist practices, Buddhist meditation, and those things tend to affect literally the biology of our brains in ways that we consider healthy and helpful. So the Buddhists tend to believe well, the Buddha, I think, believed and said that compassion for oneself is natural, and that our task is to extend that compassion out to others. And that was the Buddha's observation of, himself and those around him. My observation is that in our culture, compassion for oneself may be natural. And if a baby was born and raised without a lot of other messages, maybe they would naturally develop self-compassion. That could be true. We still have quite a lot of sort of puritanical beliefs in our culture about productivity and about working hard and about ignoring our basic needs, ignoring our emotions, ignoring even things like hunger or the need to use the bathroom if you're at work, because productivity above all else. And I think that a lot of those cultural messages lead us to ignore and not build a sense of self-compassion. We have a strange idea, many of us, not everyone, but we have a strange idea that compassion for other people is perfectly appropriate. And that if we see someone suffering, we should want to help them, right? If somebody's injured, if somebody faints on the street in front of us, if somebody's hit by a car or in an automobile accident, that we should somehow assist and help or call the authorities or do something. And yet with ourselves, we ignore. People will literally be having heart attacks and deny medical help. We don't treat ourselves with the same compassion, right? You could be in an automobile accident and feel things injured, feel that things are hurt, and kind of tell yourself, it'll heal, it'll be fine. Whereas if it were anybody else, you would encourage them to go get medical attention. And so I would never say that absolutely everything somebody like the Buddha said was absolutely true, but I'm telling you what is in Buddhist belief is that the idea that self-compassion is natural. Now, more recently, there's a famous meditation practitioner who's a Buddhist named Jack Cornfield. If you're involved at all in the mindfulness community or meditation community, you've almost certainly heard Jack Cornfield's name. He is I think a psychiatrist and a medical doctor who practices in psychiatry, but it's possible that he's a psychologist, which is a PhD in mental health. But either way, that's the area where he works, and he has this part of his career and his personal life that's very invested in mindfulness and meditation. And he is quoted as saying, if your compassion does not include yourself, then it is not complete. If your compassion does not include yourself, then it is incomplete. What's fascinating to me is that philosophically, I get that, right? Like, how can I extend compassion to other human beings or other animals or creatures in the world, or even just in nature, and not be compassionate toward myself and think that I'm a compassionate person, right? Clearly, there's room to grow. Clearly, my compassion is incomplete. What's fascinating is that the neuroscience supports this idea. So there's, what they call localization of function in the brain is not an exact science, right? We can't say, well, this part of the brain controls this thing, right? But we do know that certain areas in the brain are more involved in certain functions like sight or speech, right? A lot goes into speech, a lot. There's the mechanics of how our mouths and tongues and voice boxes work and move. There's also the understanding of language and vocabulary and syntax. And there are areas of our brain that are more involved in those areas, in those functions, right? There's also the part of language that is hearing and receiving and then interpreting what those sounds that we receive mean and making meaning of those. And so it's not an exact science, but generally speaking, there's a part of the brain called the supramarginal gyrus. And this part of the brain is associated with, primarily associated with empathy and compassion. And what we understand about the brain in both its structure and its function is that it's not made of muscle, but it functions like a muscle, meaning the more we use it, the better it gets at these things. So, the more We use our brain to solve problems, to work out Sudoku puzzles or word, what's the word I'm looking for? Oh my God. Like word puzzles that you see in the newspaper or whatever. The better we get at those things. It's funny that I lost the word for that of all things. But the more that we exercise areas of the brain, the better at things they get. The more we exercise the supramarginal gyrus, the better capacity we have for empathy and for compassion. And what's interesting, and what Dr. Kristen Neff's research has demonstrated, is that we don't have a separate area in the brain. There's not a separate structure for self-compassion. Self-compassion in this area is not different than compassion for others. And so either we're exercising that supramarginal gyrus or we're not. And we could argue that instances of cruelty and lack of compassion and lack of empathy actually exercise other areas of the brain that are contrary to the supramarginal gyrus. So even though we try to exercise compassion for others, when we're cruel to ourselves, we're undermining that brain development. And so from a very biological standpoint, it's like, if you were, well, think about it this way. If you were trying to do work to build up strength in your chest muscles, right? You're bench pressing and you're doing flies and push-ups and you're doing all these things to strengthen your chest muscles. But then you're somehow doing other things that like weaken your chest muscles, right? At the end of 6 months of that, of doing a bunch of things to strengthen those muscles and a bunch of things to weaken those muscles, at the end of those 6 months, those muscles will not have developed as optimally as they could. They would develop more optimally if we were doing things to strengthen them, to include resting and recovery, but also working them and feeding them and hydrating them. They would have much more strength gain at the end if we were not also doing things that weaken them, right? And so this is true of the areas in our brain. If we're engaged in some practices that build up activity and function in that supramarginal gyrus, that build up our sense of compassion and our sense of empathy by empathizing with others and showing compassion to others and compassion to animals and compassion to nature, but then we're treating ourselves with cruelty, which is diminishing and weakening that function in the brain, then at the end of any given period of time, we will not have developed our sense of empathy and compassion as optimally as we could. If we really want that area of the brain to function well, and if we go back to Dr. Jack Cornfield's quote about if your compassion doesn't extend to yourself, then it's incomplete, then yes, if we really want this area of the brain to fire on all cylinders, to be as functional as it possibly can be, then we should be, yes, extending compassion to others and being empathetic toward others and working on, practicing on, it's a process, not an outcome, practicing how to extend that compassion to ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about the research, because if we go back to those myths, right, there's the idea that if I extend this compassion to myself, right, like I have higher expectations for myself than I do of other people. I want to accomplish things. I want to be physically fit. I want to be well educated. I want to be financially or professionally successful. If those are my goals, I don't have those goals for other people. So yeah, if they're complacent, that doesn't affect me so much, and I can still have compassion for them. So what's the research say about how self-compassion influences us? So if you were to go on to Google Scholar and search self-compassion, or you can go on to selfcompassion.org, which was Kristen Neff's website, Dr. Kristen Neff's website, you'll see that there's quite a good number of studies. I mean, there's probably the upwards of 30 or more published peer-reviewed research studies on self-compassion outcomes. But just to highlight a couple of things. The first is there was a study that wanted to figure out whether or not self-compassion leads to improvements in mindset, right? And our mindset, we typically think of this in terms of growth or fixed mindset. So a growth mindset stems from the belief that all skills can be improved with effort. That doesn't mean that they can all be improved. So for example, if I want to be a better singer, right? A growth mindset does not guarantee me that, that if I practice hard enough, I will, star in an on-Broadway opera of some sort. Like I may never sing that well. The idea of a growth mindset is if I want to sing better and I work at it, then I can always sing better tomorrow than I do today. Yes, some people may have more natural gifts in that area than others. Some people may achieve much greater heights than others, but it's not about comparing myself to them. It's about comparing myself to me. But the caveat here is in order for me to work on it, I have to be willing to stink at it now, right? I have to be willing to be bad at it to start. I have to have a beginner's mindset. And it's got to be okay that I start out not so great. Maybe I'll find something along the way where on day one, I'll seem to have a natural aptitude for it, but I have to be willing to screw up in order to learn and grow. And that's where the growth mindset comes in. The fixed mindset is from a belief that ability is fixed and that effort won't improve it much. And that's usually about, again, if you think about self-judgment versus self-kindness, right? The idea that, well, I screwed this up, I didn't do this well, but if I go back, I wanted to learn to play chess and I did terribly at it. And if I go back, I can learn some strategies and I can become a better chess player and I can keep playing people who are better than me and keep losing. And the more I lose, the more I can learn where my mistakes are and get better at them and better at them. And then I'll eventually turn around and play somebody who used to beat me and now I'll beat them and I'll get better. I may never be a grandmaster, right? Maybe not, but I can be better tomorrow than I am today. The idea with the fixed mindset is I got whooped at chess and that's humiliating for me. I don't like to lose. I don't like to look dumb. I don't want people to think I'm dumb, and chess is a smart game. And so I don't play chess anymore unless I'm playing somebody I know I can beat, right? I try to only play when I know I can win. The challenge of it, the potential to lose, the engaging in a really competitive match where it could be anybody's game and maybe I'll win, maybe the other person will. If I have a fixed mindset, that's a threat to me. That threatens to expose my weaknesses, right? Whereas if I have a growth mindset, I'm willing to embrace my weaknesses and work at them. If I have a fixed mindset, I don't really believe that working at them is going to help much. I believe this is who I am, and I'm motivated to avoid exposing those weaknesses. So what these researchers did was they asked participants to think and journal about their greatest weakness. And they split them into 3 groups, randomly assigned groups. One group was a self-esteem group. So the group was coached on self-esteem, which is different from self-compassion. Self-esteem is like, they used students at a competitive university. I forget which school, maybe Stanford or one of the Ivy League schools. And the self-esteem group was told, listen, you're smarter than average. You got into this really difficult school. You did great in high school. You had good SAT scores. You're smarter than a lot of people. And so, when you think about your biggest weakness, just remember that, as far as the bell curve is concerned, you're to the right of the mean. You're in the smarter group. You're in the more capable group. Then there was a self-compassion group. And the self-compassion group was coached on self-compassion sorts of beliefs. Like, hey, you do a lot of things well, probably not everything. That's okay. And you think about your weaknesses, you just recognize that everybody has some and that you can work on them and you can build them as long as you're willing to deal with them. And it's perfectly okay to have those. They gave them this sort of coaching. And then the third group is the control group, and they were given no coaching at all. The assumption that the researchers made, which may or may not be true, is that the third group, without any coaching, was probably going to be very self-critical. In modern day research for mental health or social science, you're not allowed to encourage people to be self-critical. It's unethical because it could do psychological harm. So the idea is that if we don't tell them anything, there's a good chance that they're going to be self-critical, especially if they're in this great university and they, have achieved great things and now they're thinking about their weaknesses. And what they found when they studied, and so they gave them a bunch of questionnaires and a bunch of measures that were, validated and to some degree trustworthy. No research is perfect or flawless, but they made efforts to make sure that they were measuring the right things and looking at the correct things. And what they found was, of the three groups, the group that was coached in self-compassion was most likely to be as, more honest and sort of open about their weaknesses, such that when they were journaling, they would get much more in depth and say much more about it and really dig into it. And that they were much more oriented toward a growth mindset about working on those weaknesses, whereas the other two groups were much more likely to have more. And again, growth and fixed mindset is not like a light switch where either you're one or you're the other. It's a continuum. You can have more of a growth mindset about certain things and less of a growth mindset about others. And probably there are some things in your life that you feel very sensitive about, and you probably have much more of a fixed mindset about those. Whereas there are other things that you're less sensitive, and it's very easy to have a growth mindset about those. And the idea, again, is if you take those things about which you're sensitive and work on them, you can build more of a growth mindset where you're more willing to work on those. And then there will be days when that goes better, and there will be days when that goes worse. So none of this is, growth versus fixed. It's more like this continuum. But again, when you take these participants, a few hundred participants in this study, and you average out their scores, and it was statistically significant that only the group that was coached in self-compassion was much more likely to rate higher toward a growth mindset about their weaknesses, and much more likely to own their weaknesses and admit to them and discuss them complexly, as opposed to like sort of grazing over them quickly. In a second study, so then the question became, okay, so self-compassion adjusts the mindset so that you're more willing to admit to a weakness and potentially work on it. Does it change the behavior, right? Because mindset's great, but then what are you going to do? And so in a second study, they took students at this same university and they split them into the same groups. One was coached on self-esteem, right? You're smart, did great in high school, you do great in school, you go to an Ivy League college. Second group was coached on self-compassion. It's okay, like you've accomplished a lot, but everybody screws up now and then, and it's all right to be kind to yourself and recognize that you can work on things. And then the third group was given no coaching. The assumption is that they would be self-critical. And they were given a vocabulary test similar to what you would take in the SATs, where it was designed for them to fail. There's no way that they were going to pass this. And they were all told that they could retake the test again in a number of weeks. And what they did was they measured study time between the two exams. And what they found was that the study time for the self-compassion group was by far the highest. And so what that means is, for those people who think that self-compassion makes you complacent, it means that it's accepting your failures and just resting on your laurels and not doing anything about it. In this study, the group that was coached on self-compassion was much more likely to hit the books and study for that retest than the other two groups. We don't know exactly why that is, but the theory or the idea that seems to fit is that if you have good self-esteem and you feel good about yourself and you feel like you're smart and you're capable and you're above average, and then you fail something, then every time you sit down to study, it like threatens to bring up your failure again. It threatens to remind you that you did bad on this, that you might not pass it again, right? It's bringing up a vulnerability. And if you're self-critical and you already think, God, I'm so stupid, how could I fail this test? Then why study, right? If you're dumb, what are you going to do? Like, you can't improve that. That's your character. But if you're taught self-compassion and you treat yourself with the common humanity that says, well, I'm not happy that I failed, right? I don't want to fail things. I'm a high achiever. But everybody fails something once in a while, and I clearly wasn't prepared for this exam. Let me hit those books and study. And so self-compassion did, in a very meaningful way, change behavior. So that's important, right? If you're leading teams, if you're raising children, if you're in charge of other people in any kind of way, whether you are an official leader, like a military officer or a manager in an office, or just a situational leader, right? Like you're working on a group project and you don't necessarily have an official position, but people seem to look up to you. Your ability to treat yourself and them with some common humanity and kindness increases the likelihood of effort toward the goal, especially after a failure. Last, and this is not the last study, it's just the last one I'm going to talk about today. But there's, like I said, there's a ton of studies if you look online. But the last one I'll talk about today has to do with social comparison. And it very much relates back to the growth or fixed mindset. But what they did was, again, they took these students, had them fail the vocabulary test, put them in the 3 groups where they were coached either on self-esteem, self-compassion, or no coaching at all. And checked their preferences. They gave them options for like social comparison, and it's fine. Like, I know it's sort of a thing to be like, well, I don't compare myself to anybody else. I am who I am. And that would be wonderful if it were true, but all the research we have demonstrates that it's really not true. People compare each other socially to their neighbors, to their, right? And you may be able to talk yourself out of that, right? If your neighbor gets a brand new Mercedes, right, you may be able to get to a point where you go, oh, who cares? I'm perfectly happy with my Jeep. And I do drive a Jeep and I love my Jeep. But initially, usually the first knee-jerk sort of response is like, damn, they must be doing all right. They got that new Mercedes or that new BMW. And we compare ourselves like, oh, they must be making more money than I am, or they must have less debt than I do, or something like that. And so it's a human thing that we do. And probably in some cultures, it's more prevalent than others. That's probably reasonable, but it's a thing that happens. And so we also know that there are upward social comparisons and downward social comparisons. If we want to achieve something and we want to like strive and want to get good, right? I'm a guy, I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's my thing. I love it. I don't train as regularly as I should. I'd like to be better about that, but I do love it. When I go in to train, right, and they tell us pick a partner, I try to pick the brown belts, or, the people who are going to take me apart. You don't, it's an etiquette thing that you don't challenge a black belt. But if a black belt asks me to roll, I go all about it, right? That's who my upward comparison. And compared to them, I'm awful. Compared to them, I'm terrible. But that's what I'm striving for. If I were to go in and make my social comparison the new people, the people who don't know as much as I do, then by comparison, I look amazing. I look like I'm great at jiu-jitsu, but I don't improve much. I don't grow much. There's not room for me to improve because the limits of my ability are not being tested. So what this last study did was it looked at the social comparison that people would select based on how they were coached with self-esteem, self-compassion, or no coaching at all. And what they found is that both the self-esteem group and the no coaching group, so maybe self-criticism, we think, they both chose downward comparisons when it came to this vocabulary test. They preferred to compare themselves and to look at the people who did worse than they did, because it made them feel better about themselves. Like, I may have failed, but I didn't do as bad as they did. Only the self-compassion group looked for an upward comparison. Only the self-compassion group wanted to compare themselves with people who did better than they did, with the idea that if they could learn what their study skills were like, copy their habits, use them as mentors or tutors, they could then build their ability. So the research evidence suggests, if we go back to those 5 myths, and let me bring them up again and show you. We go back to those 5 myths, you'll see that the evidence does not support any of them. It's not self-pity. It's not pity, right? At no point, let's say you have, some relationship patterns that tend to end in disaster with your romantic relationships. And you get involved in a relationship and you have a big blow up with your partner, and you go back in your mind and you realize that this big blow up is part of the same old pattern. And maybe that pattern comes from some childhood trauma or some past mistreatment or abuse from an old relationship. It's not about like, oh, well, poor me, I guess that this pattern's okay. It's an idea that self-compassion requires that you recognize that this pattern comes from somewhere and that that's valid and that's real, and that it's okay. You can work on it, right? You can dissect it. You can heal your trauma. You can grow, right? It's not self-pity, and it's not complacency. It's not, oh, well, I was mistreated or abused. This is who I have to be now. No, it's validating that, yes, you may have been mistreated or abused, and that may have created these patterns, and that's real and that's valid. And while it might feel unfair, if you want your relationships to improve, you're going to have to be the person who works on it. That's self-compassion. It's not weakness, right? We've demonstrated, the research showed that these students who failed the test, it was the self-compassion group that studied hardest to pass it again. That's not weakness, right? Is it narcissistic? I'm not sure that all things that are self-focused equal narcissism, right? And so treating ourselves with common humanity, with the same level of kindness we would treat others, is not, narcissism is the idea that we're better than others, right? That's narcissism. And usually it's compensating for the fact that we actually feel worse than others. But that aside, the narcissistic behaviors and tendencies are to at least present ourselves as if we're better than others. Common humanity means treating yourself just as well, not better necessarily than you would treat anyone else. You still hold yourself accountable. You still work and strive to improve and to grow. You just do so without cruelty. You do so with the same sort of compassion, kindness, and empathy that you would show another human being who was struggling, right? And is it selfish? I don't know. Does selfish, does it mean the same thing as self-focused? Maybe. And if so, then not all selfishness is bad, right? You know, if you get on an airplane and they tell you, I know this example is played to death, and I'm sorry to not have something more creative, but it fits. You know, the idea that you put your oxygen mask on before you help others is sort of selfish, right? You're taking care of yourself first. But the idea is that if you pass out, then you can't help anyone else. And so if you can't treat yourself with self-compassion, we already saw from the neurobiology that if you can't treat yourself with compassion, then your ability to build that brain function, right, in that supramarginal gyrus is going to be limited. It may not be zero, but it's going to be limited. You're going to actually build a lot more empathy and compassion overall if you can treat yourself with similar types of compassion and empathy that you would treat others. So, you know, that's some of the research and how some of the research supports that these are myths. What's really interesting, I'm going to share another screen with you now, is that Dr. Kristen Neff, who I've referred to a few times now, has identified sort of two categories for self-compassion. There's tender self-compassion, which I think of, and I don't want to step out of line, right? Like, who am I to challenge Kristen Neff? I'm not going to, but just it makes more sense to me to think of it in terms of internal self-compassion, right? It's how I treat myself, how I talk to myself. It doesn't all have to be internal. I know she recommends a practice of intentional self-compassion where you place your hand on your heart. The idea is that human beings are hardwired to respond to certain kinds of touch. And certainly there's aggressive and violent touch, and that stimulates our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight. And then there's soft, gentle, compassionate touch, which stimulates our parasympathetic, right? Our rest and digest nervous system, the calm nervous system. And so if we touch ourselves on our heart, or kind of like hug ourselves and say, it's okay, everyone screws up, everyone makes a mistake, we can work on this. We can build this skill set, right? That actually increases the effectiveness of the self-compassion practice. I haven't seen research data on that, but I don't think it could hurt, right? Like to do this, but that's the tender self-compassion. It's how we treat ourselves, the things we say to ourselves, our mindfulness. Are we able to recognize when we're judging ourselves harshly and adjust that, right? That's the tender self-compassion, or what I refer to as the internal self-compassion. The other is what she calls fierce self-compassion. And I think of that as external or externalized self-compassion. So whereas the internal or the tender self-compassion is how we talk to ourselves, how we touch ourselves, whether we make ourselves a cup of tea or a nice meal, or maybe indulge in some comfort food, or give ourselves a rest when we're overwhelmed, sit in a bath, go for a massage, whatever that is. The fierce self-compassion has to do with taking action and protecting what we need. So drawing boundaries with others, saying no to things that are too much in the moment, which is perfectly okay to do. It doesn't mean always saying no. It doesn't mean saying no to everything. It just means saying no to the things that are energy out because we're currently overwhelmed. It's not a permanent no. It doesn't have to be. Although if somebody's asking us to do something maybe that's out of line with our values or that we don't believe in, it could be a permanent no, but it doesn't have to be, right? If they're asking for something and the timing's just bad, it can be a temporary no. But then saying yes to our needs, saying yes to getting extra rest, saying yes to maybe treating ourselves nicely for a night, right? I wouldn't consider it weakness. Maybe you disagree, that's fine. You can leave a comment, but to take one night and not do any work and just watch a movie and eat junk food or sit in a bath or whatever, that's okay. But sometimes that's not our needs, right? Sometimes our need is to get our shit together and get organized and make a to-do list for the next day. We don't have to do all those things tonight, but we can get prepared and get the list ready and make it so that tomorrow we can get up and start our day with action and do maybe that's our need, right? Maybe we're so task saturated and overwhelmed that the need is to create some sort of strategy and game plan where we can rest tonight and then wake up tomorrow with purpose and start chipping away at that to-do list. Maybe that's the need, right? And we motivate ourselves to make change, to do it, to get our hands dirty, to roll up our sleeves. These are all what Kristin Neff calls fierce self-compassion. I call it more externalized. I think of it as more externalized self-compassion. But the idea is that you need both. Both are important, right? Drawing boundaries with others while telling ourselves that we're unworthy or stupid or don't deserve it or unlovable sort of means that we can draw those boundaries, but we're unlikely to enforce them. If we don't perceive ourselves as being worthy of that boundary, then why would we enforce it? So the internal or the tender self-compassion that says, listen, I deserve what everyone else deserves. And I don't think it's unreasonable for another person to establish a boundary. Like, okay, I've done enough. Or no, you're taking advantage of my kindness. I'm not going to do that, or whatever the case may be. And boundaries don't have to be aggressive, right? I mean, you don't have to tell somebody to go fuck themselves as a boundary. You could, but you don't have to, right? You can just say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. That's too much. I'm going to draw the line there. So, thanks for thinking of me. I love that you have faith in my abilities, but I'm going to say no to that because I need to put my energies elsewhere. And then taking the action to do it, right? Taking the action to rest, to recover, to put your energies into the things that are fulfilling and meaningful for you. That's fierce or externalized self-compassion. So those are the two dynamics. And I like this graphic a lot. I think it just demonstrates it well. I realize I'm getting a little bit long on this podcast episode, especially since I don't have a guest and it's a long time to just listen to me. But there are many tools that are meaningful in the process of growth and thriving after adversity, right? And self-compassion is just one. But self-compassion happens to be one that, in my experience, is the most likely of all of them to be misunderstood, to be perceived as weakness or complacency, to be judged harshly by people. Now, self-compassion, now I need to keep my edge. Well, the research suggests that people who practice self-compassion have more of an edge than people who don't. And it's important to recognize that. And it's important to recognize that you can compassionately and kindly and gently hold yourself accountable for growth, and just do it without cruelty. That the cruelty is actually in our way. It actually creates a sense of shame, and that sense of shame keeps us from showing others our authentic, true selves, and keeps us from wanting to participate in anything that could be a challenge or could be difficult or could somehow expose a weakness. And so self-compassion is a really useful tool that is greatly misunderstood. Because I have 3 different online communities, one that is, for personal growth and thriving, one that is geared toward parenting, specifically at fathers, just because that's where I specialize, and one that's geared toward leadership. I want to wrap this up by talking about how the self-compassion just ties in with all 3 of those and why it's important. In terms of personal growth and thriving, I feel like that's been pretty covered here so far today. If you have questions or things I didn't cover that you're curious about, please drop a comment and I will absolutely readdress those either in the comment section or with a new podcast video. But please recognize, like, this idea of self-compassion leads to growth because it makes you more willing to embrace that growth mindset, more willing to take challenges, more willing to work on your growth edges and your shortcomings and turn them around into strengths, or at least make them stronger than they were in the past, right? If your strength is not, I can tell you that organization is not my strength. I'm a big picture person. I'm really good with concepts, with like day-to-day managing, filing, keeping organized, keeping my appointments in order is not my strength. Typically, when I was in a position to do so, like when I was a military officer, I tried to have my closest enlisted person be somebody who was meticulous, because it made up for my shortcoming in that area. And I always made sure I take super good care of that person, right? Make sure that if they're doing a good job, that I put them in for awards and recognitions and tell them frequently how much I appreciate them. But I also work at being more organized. Now, will I ever be as organized as somebody who is naturally sort of maybe type A and meticulous? Maybe not. But can I be more organized tomorrow than I am today? For sure. So I keep working at it. But the only thing that helps, or not the only thing, one of the things that helps me work at it is approaching it with kindness. Like, hey, okay, this is not your strength. There are other things that are my strength. There are things that I'm good at. That's okay. Like, nobody's got it all. And so I just need to work a little harder at this thing, and that's fine, right? And that makes me more able to work at it than, God, I'm such an idiot. Why can't I keep these appointments straight? Why can't I keep my files together? Why am I such a fucking mess all the time? That makes me not want to confront the problem. It makes me want to avoid it. So that's how self-compassion, a simple example of how it plays into personal growth and personal thriving. With regards to both leadership and parenting, because they're kind of similar, there's a lot of overlap. I'll tell you a couple of things. The first thing is your ability to treat those who work with you, right? Those you're leading, and the ability to treat your children with empathy and compassion is going to be limited if you don't have self-compassion as well. Remember the neurobiology. We're exercising this function in the brain with the supramarginal gyrus, with that part of the brain. And the more we treat other people with compassion, the more we exercise that and build it, the more we treat ourselves with cruelty, the more we weaken that part. So just like our chest muscles or our biceps are, if we're doing things to strengthen it, but then doing things to weaken it, we're not optimally building it. The way to optimally build it is to approach everyone, including ourselves, with compassion. Doesn't mean you don't hold people accountable, doesn't mean you don't hold yourself accountable. It just means you hold yourself and others accountable without cruelty. That's all. Keep them on the hook. Don't let them off the hook. Don't let yourself off the hook. Just do so with kindness, not with cruelty. The last piece I will say before I wrap up is that, and this pertains most to parenting, it pertains a little bit to leadership too, but most to parenting is, and if you're a parent, if your kids are, 5 or 6 or older, you know this already. Your kids don't learn what you tell them. They learn what they see. I'll say that again, your kids don't learn what you tell them. They learn what they see. If you eat poorly and don't exercise and don't manage your health at all, and maybe you have some lifestyle-based consequences from that. Maybe you have type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or other things that are related to lifestyle, and you don't take care of yourself, and maybe you smoke cigarettes, and maybe you drink too much alcohol, or whatever the case may be, right? But you tell your kids, hey, let me be the example. Don't do what I did. I don't take care of myself. Now I have all these health problems. You should take better care of yourself. Guess what? Your kids are not likely to take good care of themselves. They're more likely to follow in your footsteps and do what they've seen, right? If you want your kids to take care of their health, to be healthy, to exercise, to, maybe enjoy themselves. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a treat. You shouldn't, eat some sweets. The kids should be kids. But if you want them to have some concern about how much exercise they're getting, are they drinking enough water? Are they eating a generally healthy diet? Then they have to observe you doing that. And by the way, it's perfectly okay for them to observe you making a change and admitting that the old lifestyle wasn't great and now you're trying to fix it. That's really healthy for them too, but they need to see it. And so telling them to have self-compassion, telling them to treat themselves with kindness when you treat yourself with cruelty is not going to work. It's going to fail, almost definitely, right? If you want your kids to treat themselves with kindness, still hold themselves accountable, still work hard, still strive for better outcomes, but do so with kindness and compassion, partially because you don't want them to suffer, and partially because the research demonstrates it will make them more effective, then they have to see you treat yourself that way. You have to be the example. Telling them to do it differently than you will not create the outcome. So please learn more about self-compassion. By all means, come learn it from me. If you want, go on Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org, do some reading there. Google Scholar, you can look up some of the peer-reviewed scholarly articles that are published there and see what the research says. By all means, post questions. I will respond to everyone. Post comments on this video. For those of you who do listen or view the podcast, you can listen on Apple, on Spotify, or on Google. You can watch the podcast if you want on YouTube. Thank you. Thank you for investing your time. It's the most precious commodity you have. And the fact that you choose to listen to what I have to say means a lot to me. I don't know if I could ever express the kind of gratitude I have for that. By all means, subscribe on YouTube, like the podcast, and please comment. And thank you so much. So for right now, this has been a long discussion, but Dr. Jerry Sunshine Novak signing off, and just say, keep growing until you're thriving. Take care, y'all.